Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.
You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and I'm talking to Matthew Dickerson, the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, following last night's council meeting on Thursday evening. Hello, Matthew.
Hey, Tony, always look forward to the council meeting each month, the ordinary council meeting, but the only thing I look forward to almost as much as that is having a chat to you the next morning about the council meeting.
Well, I already knew that. Well, the first thing we should talk about is something that's been fairly controversial, and that is Cameron Park. There's one of these situations where you do one thing, it causes another problem, or vice versa. So the issue we got here is the fence is really needed from a safety point of view, particularly for playgroups and parents that are not involved in the playgroup, with having children right next to the highway and not far from the river. And the other problem is putting a fence around that existing area will actually not help the amenity or the appearance of the park. So a really hard issue to fix unless you actually move the playground altogether to where it was before.
Yes, well, it's a hard one, Tony. I don't really know the entire background. Obviously, I wasn't on council at the time when they moved that playground, so I'm not sure exactly the logic or if there was any logic for moving it, but my focus is really on moving forward, looking forward and seeing what we can do about what situations we've got presented to ourselves now. So the interesting one has been that I've been down in Wellington at different events down there and around the park, and whether it be a Rotary function or Australia Day, for example, and some people have actually commented to me about the playground there and about the fact that a fence is needed. So I've talked to a few different people, and some people have said absolutely need a fence for safety, as you've mentioned there in your intro. And then other people have said, I love the way it looks, and when I'm sitting there looking after my children, I'm keeping an eye on them, so I don't really think a fence is needed. It was actually something that I wasn't aware of, but the former Mayor of Wellington and former Deputy Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Anne Jones, actually mentioned to me the fact that there was a resolution that had gone through council when she was on council before I was on council that actually mentioned specifically about that fence and about doing something about it. So I went back and found that resolution from October 2021, and that did actually talk about the fact that a fence should be considered there at the playground, and after some public consultation, after actually surveying the public and seeing what the views of the public were, rather than just saying yes, a fence, or no fence at all. And I don't think the public really had much of a say in the original moving of that playground or in the...
They didn't at all.
Yeah.
They didn't at all. No,
or
in
the layout,
yep,
or the setup of that particular playground. So the least we could do is talk to the community about it, but also honour that resolution from October 2021. So we've gone out now, and that's the process that's being undertaken now. That survey is open until the end of April. You can access that on the council website. And essentially, we're just asking for people's opinions, get some community feedback, give us your ideas if there's something different you want, but we really just want to hear what the community has to say, and then based on that information, we'll move forward with a solution. Again, whatever solution we come up with, whatever we decide, that'll go out to public consultation before we actually implement that solution.
Yes, well, I hope at the same time they might look at the hopelessly inadequate toilet block that's there as well.
Separate issue altogether, and again, sure, I know we've had some discussions around the toilet, so that this consultation is not about the toilet. Some people may choose to add some commentary about the toilet there, but I know, speaking to some councillors just about the toilet block there and what the solution might be, we've talked about it before. There's nothing in the current budget and nothing in forward budgets to add an additional toilet block, but we are in our budget planning process at the moment, and that process has already started.
Yes.
So if there is going to be a movement from councillors to add additional toilets or change the layout or make any changes there, then that would be something they'd need to do in this budgetary process that we're in at the moment.
And that's where the public should get in there and put some submissions, I take it.
Well, at the moment, we're not asking for submissions officially, but always the councillors are there to hear from the public. So if you've got a particular view, then absolutely reach out to whoever your favourite councillor is. I know most people would have 10 favourite councillors, but reach out to the one you know the best, or maybe your local councillors. So essentially let them know that you would like that to be put on the agenda when we're discussing that draft budget, and then we will put out the draft budget for display for public consultation, and if there's nothing in there at that stage or you've got an opinion, then that's the formal process as well.
Actually, I thought you were my favourite councillor,
Oh,
Matthew.
thank you, Tony.
Well, I talk to you often enough, don't I?
Indeed.
Now, the next topic is the Binjang Wind Farm Grant Fund, which has been operating for quite a few years now. You're telling me that it fell a little bit short this year, but nonetheless, it's a great fund that helps the community. And what's happening in that space?
Yeah, it does. So you're right, the Binjang Wind Farm Community Benefit Fund. When you've got a wind farm, there's a compulsory part of that process that you've got to have a planning agreement that's got to have some funds returned back to the community. So in this particular round of funds, we had $85,000. Now that money is provided by the owners of the Binjang Wind Farm, and then our job really, there's a community committee that sits through that process to look at the applications, and then the final ratification is that comes to council. A couple of things on that. I know there were some issues in previous years where maybe some of those good applications from various Wellington organisations were not successful for reasons that didn't make a lot of sense. And I think there were some funds directed away from Wellington, which is not the idea of that fund. So I'm happy to say that $61,206.28 was given out to 10 different organisations in Wellington. I'm happy to run through those very briefly. The only comment is that we had $85,000 and we didn't actually get enough applications to use all of those funds up, which doesn't mean that money gets lost. That extra money will go through to the next round of funding. So essentially the money will still go to the community. It will just mean there's more for the next round. But one of the issues is there's a limit at the moment of $10,000 per application. So the committee that reviews that suggested that it may be a good idea to review that upper limit and maybe increase that. And certainly from my perspective, I think it makes sense to advertise more widely the whole process, make sure that people are aware of the fact that that fund is available. And just very quickly, Wellington Junior Redbacks Rugby Club had got some money, Wellington Town Band, Red Cross, the Wellington branch, Stewart Town Advancement Association, Stewart Town Action Group, Wellington Golf Club, Wellington Arts Centre, Bernardo's received some money, and Mumble Parents and Citizens Association got some money. So a range of different organisations there. But keep an eye out for that next one that I make sure that we do advertise more widely. And again, we might look at that limit, that $10,000 limit on there.
Well, it's really great to see council manage the Binjang Wind Farm Grant Fund, in a positive way, because that hasn't always happened in the past, unfortunately. So that's really good to know. The people of Wellington will be very pleased about that. So getting on to our next topic, Matthew, the Geary flood study, what's happening with that?
Yeah, so there's a few issues with flooding around the region. We've got Warngarbin, we've got Geary, we've got the cemetery that we know there's some issues out there. And sometimes people will see some flooding in an area. And I had this just recently, only a month or two ago, where someone saw some flooding in Warngarbin and said, oh, there's some water that pools down there. Can you get that fixed up? And unfortunately, it's not as easy as just go and fix that bit up, because you've got flows of water that go around various areas, and you've got to look at the big picture. You've got to look at a holistic picture to see how you might address that. And you might fix a flooding in a certain area by addressing some water flow that might be 500 metres away, so it's not always directly where it's at. So at the moment, we've been working on a flood study around Geary and a flood risk management plan around Geary. So certainly there's been some flooding, and again, the last 6 months of 2022 introduced lots of flooding in lots of areas that we hadn't seen a lot of flooding before. But basically, the flood study for Geary has now essentially been done. That's the flood planning policy that will now be updated as a result of that. And what that does is gives people, community, developers, anyone that's wanting to do some work on that land, do some development on that land, specific requirements for developing on land classified as flood-prone land. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't build on flood-prone land. It means that you might have to do something a bit different. You might have to build it up on a pad, for example. You might have to treat the ground where the water might be flowing through so that water flows in a different direction, for example. So it just gives you that information so you can be forewarned and forearmed before you do any work on that. It also gives information to current residents about what properties and how properties might be impacted by flood waters. And typically we work on the 1 in 100 or 1% chance of flood in a certain area. So it gives people more information around that. The other thing it does do, looking back at that big picture is when you know about some of those flooding areas, when you know about where water will go, then you've got an opportunity to potentially address some of that. And I'm not saying that we're going to go and wave a magic wand tomorrow and fix all those problems, because they're very expensive problems to fix some of those. But again, at least we know how it stands to start with, and then we can look at the future and how you might address those problems, or how you might address them if you were doing some development in that area.
Okay. Now, but another big area of interest is short-term work accommodation. We all know that there's a huge pressure on local accommodation, if not, all around New South Wales and the country, but particularly out here with the developments that are happening in Wellington, as well as Dubbo. It's a bit of a problem finding that accommodation. And of course, the other issue you have with it is what happens when they leave, and what kind of dwellings will we have, and what kind of area will it turn into after people have left the accommodation that might be built. So there is plans afoot, I know, for some developers to develop new accommodation, but there's also other things you're looking at, isn't there?
Yeah, and this will have a huge impact on Wellington, because obviously a lot of the work around the renewable energy zone, and not all the short-term worker accommodation is related to that, but a large chunk of it is, will obviously happen around the Wellington area. So it is pretty exciting. And I know some council areas I talk to across the state are not big fans of large projects, are not big fans of renewable energy zones, for example. But I think if we can get it right, if we can embrace it, the economic benefits for Wellington, for the region, are significant. So we really want to see how we can embrace it. You can stand there and say, we don't want it. You can stand there and put your hand up, just the same as you can stand on the edge of the beach and put your hand up and say, I don't want the tide to come in, but it's going to come in anyway. These projects are going to happen. There are going to be people living in our community that are going to be working on these projects. So how can we take advantage of that? Anecdotally, we had some information that said about 5,000 workers were needed. I don't like to use anecdotes when we're making council decisions. So we engaged a consultant to go and do some detailed analysis of the short-term worker accommodation requirements, and they found things like inland rail, Australian strategic materials, things that were not just the renewable energy zone are going to have an impact, but the numbers they came up with were over 6,000 short-term accommodation places were required for some of these projects that are going to occur. So from a council perspective, what can we do about it? How can we make sure we take advantage of that? What changes can we make? How can we embrace that? So one of the ways to do that is to make some changes to our local environmental plan to include temporary workers accommodation. So for example, that might be areas that are zoned as low density residential. You can't go and then build medium or high density residential on that, but we might put something in the LEP that says you're allowed to build that accommodation for, say, 5 years. You have to go and put the infrastructure in, the sewage pipes, the water pipes, the electricity, etc., to build that short-term accommodation. And then at the end of the 5-year time frame, all the infrastructure is in the ground, so the community gains a benefit from that. But the short-term accommodation, which might be dongers or might be something similar to that. I mean, dongers, they're a little bit better than dongers these days, but that sort of style accommodation that's very basic, very compact accommodation, that might then be removed from an area and then normal housing can be built. But the advantage for the community is the cost of all that infrastructure, that underground infrastructure, has already been taken care of. So then you end up with housing that isn't as expensive. So that's just one example. You might have, for example, some ability to build residential or have residential accommodation in industrial areas that may not normally allow residential living. So, for example, again, you might put a time frame on that. You might say in a particular area, you could have people living there for 5 years, and then after that, it reverts back to being a normal industrial area. So we want to embrace it. We want these people in our community. We want the money that's going to be brought from these projects, and we want to make sure they're living in Wellington, for example. We don't want them working in Wellington, using up the roads in Wellington, using up the resources of Wellington, and then travelling back to Dubbo or Mudgee or Orange after they've finished their day's work because they can't find accommodation in Wellington. So I think we really need to embrace that And then when we do that, then those people living there are going to go and stay at or basically use local restaurants or cafes or local supermarkets or use some of the local businesses in the community, which can have a huge impact on the area.
Yeah. Matthew, the last topic that I think we'll just quickly approach is, well, you sort of asked the question, what on earth is going on with the people managing the airports? Because they're talking about charges that the rest of all the people that use the airports, I'm talking about the operators, didn't know anything about. So what's the story there?
So we've got to focus on all of our business units, Tony, to maximise the output from those, to maximise the return to the investors, which is the residents of Dubbo. And what we need to do is make sure that all of those areas are running to their peak efficiency. So in looking at that, staff at various times might suggest different ideas. One of the ideas that was brought to council last night was to make a slight change in the way we charge airlines for the use of the airport. At the moment, we charge a per passenger fee. So you pay $17.45 when you fly. So whether you fly with Rex or Qantas or any of the other airlines that fly with RPT from Dubbo, then you basically pay that $17.45. Plus there's a security screening fee on top of that, which is done by taking the number of passengers, dividing it by the fee that they pay. One of the concepts that was discussed from our staff was the idea of reducing that passenger fee slightly and adding a maximum takeoff weight fee, and that would be at $5 per tonne. So, for example, when a plane lands at the moment, if it's got 5 passengers, they pay the fees for 5 passengers. If it's got 70 passengers, they pay the fee for 70 passengers. So it can vary a lot depending on how many passengers. But the plane landing and taking off is what slowly wears out the runway. So the idea from the staff was if we get a fee for each aircraft that lands and then a fee on top of that for each passenger, then you're getting 2 separate income streams. One's more consistent and one's more variable. The issue there that councillors discussed was that there is the variability which the airlines have to basically live with, and we think, or the councillors thought, that essentially it would be fair that we as the owner of the airport operate within that same variability. And then we've both focused on the same thing. We both want to maximise the number of passengers that go through the airport. That's good for us in terms of return on the actual investment, and that's good for the airlines as well because they want more people flying in their planes. So it was debated at length, but then ultimately it was just gone ahead with the same passenger fee that we've had in the past. And a lot of that was based on what was happening around the state as well. Very few airports across the state, in fact across the whole eastern seaboard that we looked at, charge a maximum takeoff weight and a passenger fee. Some airports that are focused on more charter services, some of the mining airports, for example, they do charge a maximum takeoff weight fee, but most of the airports that are doing RPT like Dubbo, then they're typically charging a per passenger fee. So we stuck with that, put a standard increase through, which happened each year, but stuck with the idea of just having the passenger fee.
Okay. Well, thanks, Matthew, for today's session. We've been talking to Matthew Dickerson, the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, and now it's back to all the great information and music on Binjang 91.5.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for letting me update your listeners.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.